They call me Vespera Sterling. I am 38 years old, and I pull shattered glass out of car crash victims at 4 in the morning without my pulse jumping a single beat. I fix things that are broken. That is what I do. It had been exactly 14 months since my husband packed his bags. I was wrapping up a brutal trauma rotation, walking past the neonatal wing to get to the main exit, when my former mother-in-law cornered me near the vending machines. Beatrice Thorne had this specific, chilling way of smiling that always reminded you of a bear trap snapping shut. She marched right into my personal space, practically vibrating with smugness, and pitched her voice loud enough to echo down the linoleum corridor so the triage nurses could hear every single syllable. "Walking away from you was the smartest thing my son ever managed," she declared, her eyes gleaming with malice. "He finally has a healthy baby boy, with your closest friend, no less." 8 years of being quietly labeled defective, condensed into a few seconds of pure, unfiltered venom. I did not blink.
It was a rainy Thursday. We were nearing the tail end of a punishing 14-hour shift. I was standing at the nurse's station, handing off a complicated patient chart to a night charge nurse named Julian. The maternity ward was situated just one corridor over from my surgical wing. I used it as a shortcut constantly, barely glancing at the pink and blue balloons tied to door handles. Beatrice was there visiting the new baby. Naturally. Alara had given birth 3 weeks prior, and the entire Thorne family had been treating the hospital like their own personal country club, parading in and out with gift baskets and unsolicited advice. I knew all of this. I had braced myself for the inevitable run-in. What I had not anticipated was Beatrice deliberately planting her expensive leather shoes directly in my path, waiting for me like an ambush predator. She looked me up and down, her gaze scraping over my stained scrubs and the dark circles under my eyes. Her chin tilted upward in that aristocratic way she had perfected. That was exactly when she delivered her little speech about her son, the newborn boy, and my supposed best friend. Julian froze beside me, the clipboard hovering in his hand. A passing medical assistant literally stopped in her tracks. My thumb instinctively found the silver watch on my left wrist. Down the hall, the heavy double doors clicked and began to slide open, though I kept my eyes locked on Beatrice. I did not know exactly who was walking through those doors at that exact second, but I knew what kind of avalanche I had already triggered. You need to understand my background before any of my choices make sense. I was raised in a suffocatingly small coastal town in Maine. It was the sort of community where a rumor over morning coffee became absolute truth by supper. My mom scrubbed diner floors. My dad fixed boat engines until his hands practically seized up with arthritis. I hustled through 2 different waitressing jobs in undergrad and survived on ramen and adrenaline through my medical residency. My entire worldview was built on one stubborn rule: keep your mouth shut, do exceptional work, and let the results speak for themselves. I genuinely believed that if you were quietly excellent, the truth would naturally reveal itself. People would eventually see your true character. I treated that philosophy like a religion. It made me an incredible trauma surgeon. In the OR, you do not have the luxury of having a panic attack, and you definitely do not have time to explain your feelings. You just stop the bleeding and move to the next crisis. The harsh scent of bleach, iodine, and sterile linens used to instantly calm my nerves. It signaled that I was in a place where I was competent, a place where absolutely nobody looked at me with pity. I could crack a chest open, stabilize a failing heart, and keep a terrified family from falling apart, all with a perfectly even pulse. But that exact same survival mechanism, the one that kept me so steady while someone was dying on my table, had a massive blind spot. I suffered in complete isolation. I never asked a single soul for help. When people in my personal life started spinning a viciously false narrative about me, I defaulted to my oldest habit. I did the single most destructive thing a quiet person can do in the face of a loud lie. I trusted that staying silent would be an adequate defense. I married Silas Thorne when I was 29. He possessed this magnetic, easy charm that made you feel like you were the only person in the room. He remembered everyone's birthday. He bought coffees for the interns. Half the city considered him a golden boy. And for the first few years, I completely agreed with them. We both wanted a family. We tried for over 2 years, and every month ended in the exact same empty disappointment. The failures started haunting our hallway like a ghost. Eventually, my medical brain took over. I suggested the obvious. We both needed a comprehensive fertility workup. Just basic labs. The exact same protocol I would recommend to any patient. Silas outright refused. At first, he tried to laugh it off, making jokes about his masculinity. Then, his rejection turned mean. He rigidly told me that men in his family simply did not have those kinds of defects. He gave me a long, patronizing lecture about trusting the universe and letting nature take its course. I asked him twice more. Then, I dropped the subject. You cannot physically drag a stubborn husband into a doctor's office, and a part of me still foolishly thought my patience would win him over. So, I went to the clinic entirely on my own. My test results came back flawless. Everything was perfectly normal. I remember sitting in the driver's seat of my car in the clinic parking lot, staring at the paperwork. I felt this massive wave of relief, instantly followed by a sinking, terrifying confusion. If my body wasn't the roadblock, I had no answers, and I refused to force the issue with him again. But while I was waiting for things to magically fix themselves, the people around me were busy drafting a completely different reality. Without my knowledge, Silas had started planting seeds, little quiet suggestions aimed directly at his mother. He hinted that I was the broken one. He suggested my high-stress job had ruined my body. I had no idea how incredibly fast a whispered lie could run when it was handed to the right messenger. Beatrice ran the local charity league like a mafia boss. She had raised Silas as a single mother after her husband passed away, and Silas was her ultimate trophy. He had to be flawless. If he wasn't, her entire life sacrifice meant nothing. When Silas implied I was barren, Beatrice swallowed the lie whole. She didn't ask for medical proof, she just weaponized it. It began with tiny paper cuts, a dramatic, heavy sigh over cocktails, a lingering hand on my shoulder at a charity dinner. Poor Silas, she would murmur to her friends. He wants to be a father so desperately. Then the lie grew fangs. At a hospital gala, she introduced me to the wife of the new hospital administrator. She used a tone dripping with calculated sorrow. This is Vespera, my daughter-in-law. She's a brilliant surgeon. It is just devastating that she can't give us a child. The administrator's wife looked at me with deep, embarrassing pity. Right then, I realized the lie had lapped me. I was standing there in an expensive evening gown, holding a glass of champagne, while Beatrice patted my arm as if I were a tragedy. Then she dropped her favorite catchphrase. Beatrice wasn't being malicious just for the fun of it. She was blindly repeating the polished lie her son had handed her. I drove home in dead silence that night. I should have confronted Silas the second I walked through the door. I didn't. I just kept waiting for the truth to naturally float to the surface. Let me tell you about Alara Quinn. We had been inseparable since sophomore year of high school. We survived organic chemistry together, lived in terrible apartments, and she held my hand at my father's funeral.
She was my maid of honor. When the gossip from Beatrice's circle started suffocating me, I dumped all my pain onto Alara. She would show up with takeout and listen to me cry. Or at least, she pretended to listen. Looking back, her comfort was heavily laced with poison. "You have such an amazing career, Vespera," she would say, sipping my wine. "Maybe being a mom just isn't in the cards for you. Just ignore Beatrice. Silas loves you." It sounded like support, but it constantly reinforced the fake narrative that I was the deficient one. I was entirely blind to the way her eyes tracked Silas when he walked into the kitchen. I didn't notice that she suddenly knew his gym schedule and his favorite takeout orders. I was just so desperately thankful to have one friend who wasn't judging my empty womb. She sat on my expensive sofa in the house I paid for and told me I deserved happiness. She actually meant that she deserved my happiness. People like Alara do not rob you at gunpoint. They dismantle your life brick by brick while smiling at you until you wake up homeless in your own marriage. My absolute trust in her was the fatal flaw that
Silas served me with divorce papers on a random Tuesday. I came back from a grueling 24-hour shift to find a stark white envelope on the kitchen island. His closet was stripped bare. He didn't even have the spine to look me in the eye. By Friday, he was officially living in Alara's downtown loft. The town immediately cemented the narrative. It was a neat, vicious little story. Vespera was cold. Vespera cared more about surgery than her husband. Vespera was barren, and what man wouldn't eventually leave to start a real family? Beatrice made absolutely sure the entire country club heard that version. Alara, the woman who had wiped my tears, never corrected a single soul. The two people I had loved the longest turned me into a tragic cautionary tale, and I let them do it. Fighting back felt undignified. It felt like rolling in the mud. I deleted my social media. I didn't call anyone to plead my case. I went straight back to the ER, patched up a gunshot wound, and saved a teenager's life. That felt like the only real thing left in my universe. If you have ever choked down a massive lie about your own character just to avoid causing a scene, you know the exact metallic taste it leaves in your mouth. But here is the brutal realization I finally stumbled into. The peace I was so desperately trying to protect did not belong to me. It belonged entirely to my abusers. They required my silence to keep their reputation spotless. I need to tell you about the afternoon my own hospital board taught me that staying quiet is just another form of self-destruction. The gossip stopped being a domestic issue the moment it bled into my career. I had been the obvious successor for the chief of trauma position for 3 straight years. I authored the exact emergency protocols our entire region utilized. That promotion had my name carved into it. Until the whispers slithered into the credentialing committee. They didn't find facts. They just found the ugly shadow of Silas's lie. Dr. Sterling's personal life is a bit of a disaster right now, they murmured behind closed doors. Is she emotionally stable enough to handle the trauma bay? Have you heard what her ex-husband's family went through? One of the board members, a guy who regularly played tennis with Silas, actually questioned my psychiatric fitness to lead, as if I hadn't spent the last 12 years keeping my hands perfectly steady while terrified people bled out in front of me. They handed the chief position to a junior attending who had half my surgical experience. They called me into an office, praised my clinical skills, and told me they wanted to go in a different direction. They never said the real reason out loud, but I grew up in a town built on gossip. I know exactly what a character assassination sounds like when it is dressed up in corporate HR language. Something inside my chest snapped that afternoon. A cowardly lie about my reproductive organs had destroyed my Miriam's office was tucked above a noisy auto body shop. She wore heavy tortoiseshell glasses and looked at me like a chess grandmaster analyzing a messy board. I spilled everything. The failed marriage, Beatrice's country club gossip,
Ilara's betrayal, the hospital board's cowardice, and the chief of trauma job I had lost. Miriam actually listened to every word without interrupting, a rare trait for a lawyer. When I finally ran out of breath, she tapped her pen on her desk. "What you are dealing with is textbook defamation," she stated bluntly. "Possibly false light. But I am not going to sugarcoat this. These cases are brutal." She broke down the reality of the situation. We had to prove 3 specific elements. 1, they made a demonstrably false statement. 2, they broadcasted it to third parties. 3, it caused me quantifiable financial or professional damage. "We already have the damage portion locked down," Miriam explained. "A denied promotion has a clear dollar amount attached to it. That is the easy hurdle." I sat in the hard leather chair, twisting my grandfather's watch around my wrist. "And proving the statement was false?" I asked. Miriam stared right through me. "That is the part that will require you to bleed in public. They are going to claim their gossip was the truth. They will stand in front of a judge and swear you were the one who couldn't conceive. To win this, you have to be fully prepared to rip your medical history open and prove it was never your fault." My stomach hit the floor. The idea of dragging my private medical files into a public courtroom made me sick. A clean test result did not explicitly name Silas as the problem. It only officially cleared my own name from the blame. I nearly walked right out of her office. The entire strategy felt like laying my body on a table and inviting the whole city to dissect me. I hated the exposure. But then Miriam leaned forward and said the exact words I desperately needed to hear. "Vespera, silence is not a virtue when it is actively destroying your livelihood. Sometimes, the absolute kindest thing you can do for your own soul is force these people to prove their dirty little lies." I didn't give her an answer right away. I needed time. I spent 2 agonizing weeks tearing the idea apart. I do not make rash choices. I process life the same way I review a critical patient chart, meticulously and then all at once. I listed everything I would lose. The final shreds of my privacy, the inevitable backlash from the community. People would brand me a bitter, hysterical ex-wife trying to ruin a happy new family. They had already cast me as the villain. This would just give them more material. But then I looked at the other side of the ledger. My professional reputation. My dignity. The raw, undeniable truth. Miriam spent the following weeks drafting the formal legal complaint. It was meticulous. It detailed the specific defamatory statements, the exact dates they were uttered, and the witnesses who heard them. It laid out the objective facts, the denied chief of trauma promotion, the corresponding loss of future salary, and the quantifiable damage to my professional standing. Reading that document was a surreal experience. My years of silent humiliation had been categorized, numbered, and transformed into something with actual gravity. The moment the complaint was officially filed, the news tore through our town faster than a code blue alarm. Dr. Sterling is suing the Thorns. Beatrice was incandescent with rage. She held court at her charity luncheons, loudly declaring that I had become a godless, vindictive woman, and that the grief of my empty life had warped my mind. She aggressively doubled down on every single terrible thing she had ever said about me. She had no idea that her reaction was exactly what Miriam had anticipated. Silas maintained total silence initially. Ilara stayed quiet too. But my phone started buzzing. I received cruel messages, nosy inquiries, and surprisingly, a few quiet texts of solidarity from other women who had their own histories rewritten by people they trusted. One message simply read, "Good for you. My family did the exact same thing to me." I did not reply to a single one. I just kept showing up for my surgical shifts, letting the legal machine grind forward at its notoriously glacial pace.
Miriam sat me down to explain the next phase. The opposing counsel's response would dictate the entire trajectory of the case. They only have two viable paths, she explained, leaning over her desk. Path 1, they claim the comments were merely hyperbole or personal opinion. Hurt feelings, but nothing legally actionable. That route is frustrating for us, but it gets them out of the worst of it. She tapped a silver pen against her legal pad. Path 2, they plant their flag in the ground and argue the statements were absolute fact. They argue that you genuinely were the medical reason the marriage failed. That is the path I am aggressively hoping they choose. I asked her why. Miriam smiled, looking incredibly dangerous. Because if they claim it is a medical fact, they are legally obligated to prove it. And to prove it, they have to unlock a door they want kept shut. They chose the second path, predictably. Silas's attorney filed a formal response that planted their flag exactly where Miriam wanted it. Stripped of the legal jargon, their defense was simple. The statements about me were not defamatory because they were medically accurate. I was the reason the marriage remained childless. The fault, they swore on paper, belonged entirely to my biology. When Miriam called to deliver the news, I could hear the raw thrill beneath her professional tone. They just gave us the magic words, she said. Truth is an absolute defense in defamation, but they didn't think 3 steps ahead.
She paused for emphasis. To prove you were the infertile party, they have to present a complete medical picture to the judge. Now, reproductive files are highly protected. A judge will not unseal them casually. But they just argued, under penalty of perjury, that the biological failure was undeniably yours. They cannot make that aggressive claim and simultaneously refuse to let the court look at his medical history. It is a tiny crack in the armor, and I can tear a crack wide open. I sank slowly into one of my dining room chairs. Meaning? I asked. Meaning, Miriam clarified. They just put Silas's own reproductive health into play. He spent years hiding his status behind your silence. By swearing to it in a legal filing, he just handed us the justification to finally subpoena his records. No guarantees, but it is the best leverage we have. For nearly 7 years, my body had been a topic of casual debate at country clubs and dinner parties. And by trying to officially win that argument in a courtroom, the Thorns had made a fatal error. They had inadvertently invited the...
That night, sleep was impossible. So, I applied my surgical training to my own life. I mentally reconstructed the timeline, reviewing the past like a complex trauma chart, searching for the anomaly I had missed. I found it. 7 years ago, early in our marriage, Silas had driven 3 hours into the city for what he claimed was a routine specialist physical. He was gone the entire day. When he returned, his entire demeanor had shifted. He was unnervingly quiet, inexplicably short-tempered, and he immediately poured himself a heavy glass of scotch, something he never did on a Tuesday. I asked him if the appointment went well. He snapped that the specialist was a complete hack, the trip was a waste of time, and he changed the subject so aggressively, it felt like a door slamming in my face. Here is the detail that kept me staring at the ceiling until dawn. After that specific trip to the city, he never once mentioned fertility testing again. Prior to that day, he had at least feigned interest in the process. After that day, the subject was dead. And right around that same time, the first quiet rumors about my condition started circulating. At the time, I dismissed it as a bad mood. I didn't connect the dots because I wasn't looking for a betrayal. You do not naturally audit the person you sleep next to.
Miriam listened to the story about the city clinic without taking a single note. That meant she was taking it seriously. When I finished, she sat back.
A bad mood isn't evidence, she admitted, but it is a compelling reason to ask a judge for a specific subpoena. She outlined the strategy. Because the defense had explicitly blamed my fertility and insisted the issue was mine alone, Miriam could petition the court to compel the release of Silas's relevant medical records. If he wants to legally claim it was your fault, she said, the law permits me to verify if it was actually his. You cannot selectively open the door to medical privacy. She filed the motion days later. Silas's legal team fought it with desperate ferocity. That aggressive pushback confirmed my suspicion. Lawyers do not fight that hard to protect an empty box. They argued privacy violations. They argued relevance. They threw everything at the wall to keep that specific medical file sealed. The judge scheduled a hearing, leaving me suspended in a terrible limbo. For someone who thrives on immediate, testable answers, the waiting was agonizing. I am accustomed to ordering a CT scan and immediately seeing the internal damage. This were different. This was begging a judge for permission to even look for the damage. I dragged myself through my hospital shifts, repairing shattered femurs and reading x-rays, trying desperately not to obsess over a hidden folder in a city clinic that held the power to validate my entire...
Miriam constantly urged patience. The legal system is intentionally slow, she reminded me. It allows the raw emotion to bleed out before the facts arrive. I wasn't afraid of the facts. I was terrified they would find a legal loophole to hide them forever. Before the judge ruled on the subpoena, Miriam needed me to sign a verified complaint, a sworn affidavit attesting to every date, quote, and witness under penalty of perjury. She dropped the heavy stack of paper on her desk, dotted with neon signature tabs. "Read every single word," she ordered. "Only sign what is absolutely, undeniably true." So I read it. The charity dinners, the administrator's wife, the exact venomous phrasing Beatrice used about women being too ambitious, the board meeting transcripts, the calculated loss of income. Seeing my years of silent suffering neatly organized into sterile legal paragraphs changed something fundamental inside me. It exposed the lie for the fragile, pathetic thing it really was. When I lifted the pen, the trap was set. The verified complaint was active. The legal mechanism designed to rip open that hidden folder was now moving. Miriam neatly stacked the documents. "Now we wait on the judge," she said. I nodded. For the first time in a decade, the waiting didn't feel like slow torture. It felt like watching a lit fuse burn toward powder. The judge's ruling came down on a bleak, rainy Tuesday afternoon. I was mid-shift. I ducked into a sterile supply closet, surrounded by IV bags and surgical tape, my heart hammering against my ribs. "The judge granted the motion," Miriam announced over the phone. "There are strict parameters, but she granted it." She explained the conditions. Because the defense actively weaponized my medical status, the court ruled that Silas's fertility records were presumptively discoverable. They would not become public record. The documents would be transferred under a strict protective order, reviewed privately by the attorneys and the judge, and utilized solely for the scope of the defamation case. "This isn't a silver bullet yet," Miriam warned, ever the pragmatist. "The file might be completely empty, but they have lost the power to hide it." I stood in that tiny closet. The first indication that the Thorns world was collapsing didn't come from Silas or Beatrice. It came from Alara. She sent a frantic text message at midnight, breaking a year of dead silence. "Please stop the lawsuit. Think about the baby." I read the words until they blurred. She had orchestrated the destruction of my marriage, stolen my life, and never once apologized. Now, suddenly, she was desperately begging me to drop a civil suit that technically did not involve her. That was the glaring inconsistency.
The lawsuit was strictly between me, Silas, and Beatrice. It was regarding my lost career and my defamed character. Why was the woman who had supposedly won the grand prize terrified of a subpoena? Why was a mother, safe in her new life with her new family, begging her ex-best friend not to look at old medical files? People who beg you to stop digging usually know exactly where the bodies are buried. I did not reply. I sat in the dark, turning the text over in my mind, sensing the outline of a massive, devastating secret. Here is the absolute truth about remaining calm under extreme pressure. The people who scream the loudest are usually the ones terrified of what the silence will reveal. I wasn't furious with Alara. I was sharply, clinically curious. If you appreciate watching a house of cards slowly collapse, make sure you hit subscribe. Because Alara's midnight panic didn't make me want to withdraw the suit. It confirmed that I needed to push harder. An incredibly frightened woman had just accidentally confessed that the lie was deeper than I ever imagined.
The medical records arrived exactly 8 days later. I need to be perfectly clear about the protocol. I did not intercept the file. I am a licensed physician. I respect HIPAA laws fiercely. I had no legal or ethical right to view his unredacted charts. The documents were delivered securely to Miriam, under the judge's protective order. She reviewed them in the presence of opposing counsel, exactly as mandated. Then she called me into her office, a rare, urgent request. I knew the verdict before I even sat down. Miriam wore the carefully neutral expression professionals use when delivering life-altering news. 7 years ago, she began softly, Silas did visit that specific city clinic. She slid a single sheet of paper across the desk. Most of it was heavily redacted under a black marker. Only one line remained visible. The diagnosis. A term I had seen 1,000 times in medical texts. Azospermia. Complete absence of measurable sperm. Silas had been definitively informed, in cold medical terms, that fathering a biological child was practically impossible.
I drove home with a copy of that single redacted page tucked inside my purse. I left the car radio off. I had braced myself for a wave of vindictive triumph. I didn't want to be the kind of person who celebrated someone else's humiliation. But the triumph never arrived. Instead, I was hit by a profound, suffocating wave of grief. I had wasted 6 years of my life carrying a deeply painful wound that didn't belong to me. Every condescending look from Beatrice, every fake sympathetic sigh from Alara, every night I laid awake, hating my own biology, wondering why my body had failed my marriage. It was all a meticulously crafted fiction. Silas had cowardly transferred his own deep-seated shame onto my shoulders, forcing me to carry it in public, while his mother gleefully.
The medical arithmetic was brutal and unforgiving. The chances of natural conception were virtually zero. This left a massive, unavoidable contradiction. Either the clinic had made a catastrophic diagnostic error, which is incredibly rare, or the child the entire Thorne family was celebrating had been fathered by someone else entirely. Suddenly, Alara's desperate midnight text made perfect, horrifying sense. Please stop the lawsuit. Think about the baby. She wasn't trying to protect Silas's pride from a defamation suit. She was utterly terrified of what his unsealed medical records would prove to the world. Because Alara knew the truth. She knew exactly whose child she was holding. I need to be absolutely precise about my actions here. I did not illegally access the infant's medical files. The baby was completely innocent, and I harbored no ill will toward him. All I possessed was a glaring medical contradiction, handed to me by Silas's own arrogant legal defense. They swore I was the infertile one. The legal records proved it was him. And a newborn baby proved that someone in that house was living a massive lie. I called Miriam from my car. There was a much bigger secret buried here, I told her. She didn't hesitate. Then we let the legal process unearth it, not us. The man who eventually walked into Alara's hospital room, the one I mentioned at the very beginning, was named Julian Vance. I didn't know him at the time. I learned his story the right way, slowly, through undeniable facts. During the exact same months Alara was actively destroying my marriage to secure Silas, she had also been quietly involved with Julian. Julian was a decent, quiet guy who mistakenly believed they were building a real future together.
When Alara finally secured Silas and his family's money, she discarded Julian completely. She blocked his number, severed all ties, and never mentioned she was pregnant. She coldly calculated that he would just fade away, never putting the timeline together. But the dates didn't sit right with him. Julian started asking quiet, persistent questions to mutual acquaintances. And that specific morning, a careless friend let the hospital name and delivery date slip. So he showed up. He walked into the maternity ward to demand answers about the child he strongly suspected was his own flesh and blood. And the precise second Julian stepped through those sliding doors, the one man Alara prayed would never find her, every ounce of color drained from her face. That is the exact image I want to leave you with. Beatrice Thorne, standing smugly by the elevators, deeply convinced her son's perfect family proved my worthlessness. And just a few feet away, walking directly into the center of their pristine country club lives, was the living, breathing proof. I did not orchestrate that hospital corridor collision. I simply asked Beatrice a direct question, and Julian Vance happened to step off the elevator at the exact right second. The entire Thorne dynasty began to crack without my interference. Julian had questions, and family court was eventually going to answer them. But my mind kept circling back to Silas. This was the detail that shifted his actions from pathetic to purely evil. He had possessed hard medical proof of his sterility for 7 years. Therefore, when Alara announced her pregnancy, Silas knew with absolute scientific certainty that the child did not belong to him. He claimed the boy anyway. He stood in front of his wealthy mother, his country club friends, and our entire city, presenting that infant as proof of his virility. He used a child he did not father as the final nail in my coffin. He viewed that baby merely as a prop. It was the ultimate piece of evidence in... Beatrice showed up at my apartment building 2 days before the preliminary hearing. She arrived on a Sunday morning, wearing her expensive church clothes. I genuinely considered leaving the deadbolt locked. When I finally opened the door, she looked physically diminished. Her shoulders slumped. She did not offer an apology. I want to be entirely clear about that, because a naive part of me hoped she might. She stood on my welcome mat and asked me, her voice trembling, to withdraw the lawsuit. "Do it for the Thorne family legacy, Vespera," she pleaded. "Do it to protect the baby." As I listened to her, my anger actually faded into something colder. I realized I was looking at a woman who had been thoroughly manipulated by her own child. She was a widow who poured her entire identity into raising Silas, building her reality on the absolute certainty that he was a good man. She didn't spread those vicious rumors about my ambition because she was intrinsically evil. She spread them because Silas handed them to her, heavily disguised as his own private tragedy. She loved him too much to demand proof. For a fraction of a second, standing in my doorway, I pitied her. But then she fell back on her oldest habit. She repeated the exact...
Silas's attorneys sent over a formal settlement offer.
It was a textbook quiet resolution. They agreed to pay a substantial sum, issue a heavily worded private retraction directly to the hospital's executive board, and formally clear my professional record. The only condition was an airtight non-disclosure agreement. I had to seal the files and never discuss the marriage again. Miriam placed the thick document on her desk and watched my reaction. Logically, this is a massive win, she told me. You recover your lost income, the board sees the truth, you walk away with your career fully restored. She was factually correct. By every standard legal metric, I had won. But I also knew what accepting that offer actually meant. The truth would be whispered behind closed doors in the hospital administration suite, and then permanently buried in a locked filing cabinet. Meanwhile, Beatrice would keep dropping her subtle insults at charity galas. Silas would keep playing the proud father to a child that wasn't his. The rumor of the cold, barren surgeon would survive in the dark corners of the city, where corporate retractions do not reach. I sat with the offer for 10 minutes. Then I told Miriam to reject it. I did not do this out of spite. I did not need to watch Silas suffer. But a private truth is just a polite version of a lie. For 6 years, they had dragged my name through the mud in public. The correction had to happen in the exact same arena. I refuse to accept a whispered apology for a public execution, I told Miriam. I am going to say the truth out loud exactly once, and then I am dropping this weight for good. Miriam slowly capped her pen. A sharp smile crossed her face. Then we go to court, she replied. Wear a suit you feel comfortable going to war in. The hearing took place in the county courthouse on a freezing Tuesday morning. I assumed my nerves would be wrecked. I can operate on a ruptured aorta without blinking, but the stakes here felt different. This time, I was the one laid open on the table. The gallery filled up fast, which tells you everything you need to know about the gossip economy in our city. 2 senior members of the hospital board sat near the back, clearly there to figure out how badly they had misjudged me. Several prominent women from Beatrice's charity league claimed the middle rows. Beatrice herself sat rigidly behind the defense table. Silas sat next to his lawyer, sweating through a custom suit that suddenly looked a size too big. Ilara sat alone in the 4th row, staring blankly ahead. And Julian Vance sat quietly, just a few feet behind her. I sat next to Miriam and felt the heavy, suffocating weight of the last 7 years gather in one room. These people had been the silent audience to my systematic character assassination. They watched me get branded as defective and did absolutely nothing. Now, I was forcing them to watch the reversal. The lie had been loud and public. The truth required the exact same audience, or the damage would never truly be undone. I had zero intention of causing a scene. I was there to let the cold, hard facts stand up in the fluorescent light. The judge entered. The room fell dead silent. I pressed my thumb against the glass of my grandfather's watch. Miriam never raised her voice. She constructed her argument the exact same way I approach a complex surgery: methodical, precise, and without hesitation. She read the defamatory statements into the record. She documented my financial losses. Then she addressed Silas's specific defense, that the biological failure was legally mine. Miriam asked the judge to admit the medical records Silas's own legal defense had forced into play. Thanks to the protective order, she only read the single necessary line. 7 years ago, Silas Thorne was definitively diagnosed with a condition that made biological fatherhood practically impossible. The atmosphere in the courtroom physically shifted. I watched the Charity League women slowly turn their heads to stare at Beatrice, who had turned the color of ash. Miriam then quietly laid down the final piece of the puzzle. The defense swore my body was the problem. The medical file proved the problem was Silas. Yet Silas was publicly claiming a biological son.
Miriam smoothly noted that the child's paternity was currently the subject of an active family court petition, and preliminary genetic testing from that separate case completely excluded Silas as the father. She delivered the information with the flat, clinical tone of a radiologist reading a scan. Silas snapped. He shot up from his chair. "That is completely— You have no right!" he yelled, his voice cracking violently. The judge immediately ordered him to sit. Beatrice scrambled to her feet, completely ignoring decorum. She pointed a shaking finger at me, screaming that I had fabricated the documents, that I was a bitter, jealous woman trying to ruin her family. The two of them unraveled in front of the entire town, while I sat perfectly still. Beatrice lost whatever dignity she had left. In her panic, she reached for her favorite weapon. "Some women just aren't built for motherhood!" she shrieked across the aisle. I stood up. I didn't rush. I used the exact same impossibly calm tone I use when I have to tell a family their loved one is gone. "You are completely right, Beatrice," I said into the dead quiet room. One person in this marriage was entirely incapable of having children.
I let the silence stretch out. I looked directly at Silas, then back at his mother. The medical file sitting on the judge's bench only had his name printed on the tab. Beatrice's shaking hand slowly dropped to her side. Silas buried his face in his palms. The women from the Charity League, the same people who had traded sympathetic whispers about my empty womb for years, sat frozen in their seats as the reality set in. I was not medically broken. I had never been broken. The man who allowed an entire community to believe I was defective was currently hyperventilating 6 feet away from me. I said the truth out loud, in the room where it mattered most, and I felt the invisible weight finally slide off my shoulders. The immediate aftermath lacked the cinematic drama you might expect. Silas didn't scream again. He just sat there, completely defeated, while his lawyer desperately requested a recess. When the judge agreed, Silas didn't even stand up. He stayed slumped in his chair, watching his meticulously crafted fiction evaporate.
The concrete changes happened quickly. Silas's sterling reputation simply disintegrated. You cannot hide from a public court transcript in a city this size. He packed up and moved 3 states away within 2 months, looking for a new zip code where his name didn't mean anything. I didn't care. The truth didn't require me to hunt him down. It just needed oxygen. The hospital board handled my situation quietly. 3 weeks after the hearing, the administrator called me into his office. He looked deeply uncomfortable. He offered me the chief of trauma position, stating that their previous concerns about my personal stability were entirely unfounded. It wasn't a direct apology, but in corporate medicine, it was as close as I would ever get. I took the job, not out of spite, but because I earned it. My first day as chief, I walked into the ER and inhaled the sharp scent of iodine and bleach. It no longer felt like a place I used to hide from my life. It felt like territory I had reclaimed. Beatrice lost her social empire. The Charity League quietly phased her out. I actually felt a brief flicker of sorrow for her. The tragedy of a woman who chose her son's lie until it cost her everything. Ilara and Julian sorted out their custody issues in family court. I never spoke to Ilara again. Some friendships are just illusions that eventually expire. I kept my apartment, I kept my career, I kept my grandfather's watch. I wrote one final, very brief letter to Beatrice. I refuse to carry your son's lie anymore. You should put it down too. I never received a reply. That night, I took off my watch and set it on the nightstand. My grandfather was right. Patience isn't passively waiting.
It is surviving until the exact right moment presents itself. If you are carrying a label someone else forced on you, drop it. State your truth, and then walk away.